Welcome to Coruzant Technologies, home of the Digital Executive Podcast.
Welcome to the Digital Executive. Today's guest is John Mannino. John Mannino is the Chief Compliance Officer at sFOX. He joined sFOX after more than 2 decades of extensive operations and regulatory compliance experience at Goldman Sachs, where his last position was Senior Vice President, Global Head, Regulation Assurance and Compliance. He has worked at Goldman Sachs offices in New York City, Los Angeles, Zurich, and London, where he oversaw daily compliance across multiple global regulators in the OTC, derivative margin, and collateral sector, while also continuing to navigate the rapidly changing derivative regulatory environment as it emerged around the world. Well, good afternoon, John. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Absolutely. Same here. Love doing this stuff. And John, appreciate you making the time, hailing out of the great state of California there in LA. I'm in Kansas City, so we're making up some time here. But John, let's just jump right into your first question here. What motivated your transition from traditional finance markets at Goldman Sachs to the cutting edge cryptocurrency market at sFOX? And how did your previous roles influence your approach as the Chief Compliance Officer there at sFOX?
Yes, so Brian, it's very, very interesting. So when I look at my time at Goldman specifically, a good chunk of that time was really sort of spent in the OTC derivative marketplace. And it was really sort of, in the margin and collateral space for a whole portfolio of, OTC derivatives. And so those included things like interest rate swaps, credit derivatives, equity derivatives, FX, commodities. So it was kind of like the whole host of OTC type of derivative trading. And, that was a really, while I was there, it was during a time of really explosive growth in that area where, we were just doing a ton of trading in that space. And the volumes were kind of going through the roof, and we were really just trying to actively manage it, all of that. And then, and that was a pretty sort of unregulated, type of product really sort of at that time, or, this is sort of right before the sort of the financial crisis of 2008 really happened, right? Then the 2008 financial crisis happens, the world kind of, almost implodes there, if you will. And a lot of stuff really sort of changed in that marketplace. And one of the biggest changes was, the implementation of the Dodd-Frank rules, and then more broadly, kind of the uncleared margin rules, more on a kind of a global scale. And so that industry in and of itself kind of went from something that, was very cutting edge, very technology focused, and was really sort of having explosive growth, to one that kind of came to a bit of a screeching halt, and then really became one that was very regulatory focused from that. And so kind of pivoting sort of from that, I'm taking a lot of the things that I learned sort of from that time and bringing that into really sort of this new role in the sort of the crypto space, right? I think it's really sort of fascinating, right? Those derivative products, there's a lot of sort of similarity, if you think about it, right? It's a combination of utility, it's a combination of technology and mathematics, kind of all kind of coming together into one sort of new kind of product. And so what I'm doing right now is really just trying to kind of leverage the experience that I've had in that space, and really trying to manage this kind of on a go forward basis, because there's a lot of things that we can kind of learn. There's, some things that, didn't go so well, and some things that are really, important new things that we should be considering in the crypto space. So a lot of those things I'm trying to kind of bring forward. And I think that there's a really good synergy between the old sort of traditional finance world and sort of this new kind of, decentralized finance world.
Thank you for the backstory. And obviously you can bring a lot to the table as we look to really move into this digital space. By the way, this publication of ours here is built on blockchain. So we're enthusiasts of blockchain technology and crypto, and we really do love this. So John, I appreciate the backstory, and I welcome you to this community, which we need to give some more support to, obviously, during these times. But John, switching gears to the next question, given your role in bridging traditional and crypto markets, what do you believe are the key factors driving institutional adoption of cryptocurrencies? And how is sFOX facilitating this transition?
Yes. So, I think that there are a lot of important factors. I want to touch upon really what I kind of consider four key ones. So the first and foremost, right, is I think, from an institutional perspective, I think that there is a growing acceptance of this as a new asset class and the legitimacy sort of tied to it now. And I think one of the biggest things, which we've just recently seen, right, is the really sort of the approval by the SEC of the Bitcoin ETFs, right? This has really just sort of solidified, Bitcoin in and of itself as a true sort of cryptocurrency and the leader in the cryptocurrency space, but really sort of helped sort of legitimize the cryptocurrency, universe, if you will, a bit. And so I think with that was like a number one, that was like really, really important key factor in driving sort of the institutional adoption of this, right? So this is critically important. A second piece, right, is I think, crypto really, right, this adds to a portfolio diversification, right? This is a brand new asset class and it now allows institutions to have sort of exposure to a new asset class that really sort of hasn't been out there, that really helps allow for a proper, diversification in a wide sort of portfolio of assets that you have. So I think that is, critically important really from, an ongoing perspective. A third item I would say is like, there's just demand from clients, right? Like there is a huge appetite for this. And I think, the Bitcoin ETF is, I think, a perfect example of showing sort of like that appetite, right? Like in record time, the Bitcoin ETF surpassed silver as a commodity ETF. Is really sort of only just sort of tracking behind gold and is kind of like nipping on its heels really as the leading commodity ETF out there, right? And so really where that's coming from, like that's really just this pent up demand that's really kind of coming from clients that want to have some sort of exposure to this new asset class, right? Again, because it ties on, it's all the building blocks of the other points I've just sort of said, right? It's just the growing acceptance and the legitimacy of it and the diversification of kind of having this in your portfolio. I think also really what's ended up happening then too is we've also begun to see now the institutional infrastructure that's sort of associated with this. And this includes really, custody solutions that help make custody of crypto more widely accessible and very easy for people. The growing number of sort of trading platforms that are sort of out there, just like sFOX is, and then just sort of, these sort of things like the Bitcoin ETF, which are regulatory compliant investment products, right? All of those things are just really, really important in the whole sort of, infrastructure and ecosystem of the crypto space. And so, with all those, like those are things that I think also then too, like, we have, we at sFOX here have some really, really great solutions that help sort of meet those institutional sort of demands, if you will, in this space. We have a Wyoming-based trust company that is sort of, our custody solution, right? And so what ends up happening is you can custody your crypto assets through our Wyoming trust company that is a bankruptcy-protected, Wyoming regulated entity, right? And so what that really means when I talk about bankruptcy-protected is that those assets, including all your crypto, right, are clearly ring-fenced and clearly segregated away from any sort of firm assets. And, we saw this as a really problematic item that occurred, within the FTX space and the FTX bankruptcy, right? Where there was just a ton of just commingling of firm assets and client assets. And so, we're still trying to unravel all of that today. And so our safe trust offering really allows for, that those to be protected in the unlikely event of, our bankruptcy, and then also has the regulatory sort of oversight of all of that. One final thing that I do want to kind of just sort of touch on here then too is, I've talked a little bit, about, the Bitcoin ETFs and how that has been, pretty transformative for our industry. But the interesting thing sort of about this is and I do get it, right? For many institutions, this is a way to have exposure to this asset class without actually having to physically own, Bitcoin as an asset. But, when you take a step back and you look at, and for most investors, things like, like a gold ETF and a silver ETF, like those commodity type of ETFs, they make sense because, right, it's hard to, actually go out and physically buy gold, large quantities of gold to store it, and then to subsequently sort of sell it. So, an ETF makes a lot of sense in that space, right? It's an easy way to sort of facilitate that. With Bitcoin, right, you don't necessarily have that, right? So, Bitcoin in and of itself, like, as I said, you could come to, come to our site, open up an account through our trust company where you have your custody there. You kind of go through just sort of your normal AML and KYC type of stuff, but we can get that account open pretty fast, and then you have the ability to go out and physically buy the Bitcoin and hold it and have custody of it and sell it, buy it and sell it and hold it however you want, however long you want. And again, we're 24/7, it's a 24/7 market. So you could buy and sell anytime that you want. And so, while ETFs have been great in the legitimacy aspect of it, the reality of it is for most investors, right, they could have already very easily bought and sold Bitcoin. And so while we love the Bitcoin ETF and kind of, the ability to, for a wider group and especially for institutions which may have a little bit more restrictions around kind of having, direct access to crypto, for most investors, right, you can kind of have access to Bitcoin without actually having to, go through an ETF model.
Thank you. I appreciate breaking all that down. I really do appreciate that, John. And John, switching gears, just if you could briefly share, based on your various article insights that you do provide, what are your predictions for the future of cryptocurrency regulation, especially around concerning global securities and financial innovation acts?
Yeah. Well, I wish I had a crystal ball that could easily predict this, but I will take the easier ones first. And so what I'm going to do is first, Brian, go outside the US, right? And so outside the US, there is some really, really important legislation that actually has been passed. There is a European Union legislation, which will be going live later this year, which is called MiCA, which allows for cryptocurrency platforms like ourselves to obtain a license through one of the European Union countries, and then allows for sort of passporting across all European Union countries. And so this helps tremendously in kind of a broader outreach, as opposed to having to get a license country by country type of situation. And it kind of levels the playing field and makes sort of everybody, following all the same, and adhering to all of the same rules from a European Union perspective. So that's a really critical piece. We've seen other things happening, in the past few years, in the UK specifically, there is some crypto legislation that has been moving along and passing through a lot of the regulatory environment, specifically in the FCA. And then in Asia, we've seen a lot of stuff then too. specifically, with the Monetary Authority in Singapore, the Hong Kong Authority, and actually also we've been seeing, things happening sort of in the Japanese space. So there's a lot of great activity that's actually happening from a regulatory perspective outside the US. And, while that's great, it does create a point of concern really for many US based companies, and just sort of thinking about how, the US is really starting to fall behind many other places around the world in this space, really because we haven't been able to clearly get our act together as it relates to any type of crypto regulatory environment sort of in the US. We have seen, time and time again, what is happening with the US regulators, specifically with the SEC, is this, this approach of, regulation by enforcement, which is very, very problematic for many, many people within the industry. And then that's just not an approach that is going to really sort of work, and is not a long-term sustainable approach, and is really potentially forcing people outside of the US to sort of set up shop, in jurisdictions that are, outside the boundaries of the US, which is, not necessarily the most ideal solution. And so I think, there's a few things that I do pin some glimmer of hope on in, from a US perspective. Number one, I think is the first thing is just sort of stablecoin legislation, which I think is what is commonly referred to as the low-hanging fruit in this space, right? This is pretty common sense legislation. It kind of puts, some of the other kind of, questionable sort of stable coins processes that are there. It puts a little bit more structure and organization around kind of how, a stable coin can be monitored and the tracking of all of that. And that is really, really important because stable coins continue to be an important component within the cryptocurrency space. And then I look at things, that are, and in this very sort of polarized US political environment, I do feel that, crypto is something that is a little bit more bipartisan than most things. And I do look at a piece of legislation that is out there, which is put together by two senators who I think are probably polar opposites on everything else. But the Loomis-Gillibrand bill, which is Cynthia Loomis, who is a Republican from the state of Wyoming, and Kristen Gillibrand, who's a Democratic senator from the state of New York, they've come together and they really have put together a very, very comprehensive bipartisan bill that in reality looks a lot like a lot of the components of Dodd-Frank, in the sense of it looks to have both the CFTC and the SEC be regulators of crypto, basically kind of coming back down to, if the crypto is deemed a security, which is the big kind of giant question that has been, causing a lot of in the industry, then it falls within the SEC. But if it really is a commodity, where how most people feel that most cryptocurrencies are, then it falls within the realm of the CFTC. And that is the same kind of framework that Dodd-Frank put in when we looked at kind of going back to like the derivative space that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And so with those two key kind of components, I think what you see then is this idea that, you'll have a dual regulator, but it really kind of comes down to whether the crypto is a security or not. And then what you really have to have in that bill is some rules of the road, and really sort of putting down, pen to paper around what exactly is and how you determine whether a cryptocurrency is a security or not, and having that actually be part of a legislation and not something like that we do today, which is done through the Howey test, which is really just part of the results of a lawsuit. And so it's not actually a pure legislation component. And so I think with that, though, I do have hope that that is going to be sort of where things are going to be sort of moving towards from a US perspective. But, I look at things like Europe, and I look at parts of Asia, and they are really starting to kind of pull away from the, where the US is from a regulatory perspective. And I think, in a post FTX world, especially institutions are looking for a compliant organization to do their crypto trading in. And I think, many US companies like us, like many other players, like we want to be compliant, just give us the rules of the road and we will be compliant, but you gotta put down the rules of the road. So that's where I think sort of where things are heading in the crypto regulation space right now.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Really do. And, again, you bring a wealth of knowledge to this industry. So, John, lightning question here, lightning round. If you could give us your thoughts on this next question here in about 30 seconds.
Sure.
Drawing from your extensive background in TradFi, right? Traditional finance and compliance, what lessons do you believe the crypto industry should adopt to foster growth while ensuring security and compliance?
Yeah, I think the number one key thing, right, that we have seen time and time again is, you need to have a compliant organization, backing up your platform, right? And that is shown where we've seen, Binance and FTX. They've clearly showed the consequences of having a poor risk management program and really sort of lacking on the compliance side of things. And I think, that is a key factor, right? That many, that we've seen now with many of our in looking into, they want to do business with a compliant organization. And that is really the number one thing that we need to draw, the cryptocurrency industry needs to draw in and really help with future growth.
Thank you. And I think that is important. Although if you look across a broad, events in the TradFi industry, there's been a lot more, but it's okay. We know we still need to bring some of that risk mitigation to the crypto industry, of course. So I do appreciate your thoughts, and I love that you coming out of TradFi, moving into DeFi. It's really going to help, I think, faster adoption. So John, it was such a pleasure having you on today, and I look forward to speaking with you real soon.
Thanks, Brian. Always happy to chat with you.
Bye for now.